Gus was kind enough to bring this presentation up for me this time around. Okay, so I know you've heard a lot about these local laws. There are two documents here, the Building Resiliency Task Force report, which there were 200 plus members, and I'm sure the majority of those members are here in this room with us right now. So you're intimately familiar with this particular document. It contains 33 actionable proposals for making New York City buildings more resilient. And on the right-hand side, there's the Special Initiative for Rebuilding and Resiliency, and that has 250 recommendations in it for hardening New York City. So there's a lot of local laws to come, I would assume. But there are 27 total resiliency-related city council bills. Of them, 17 local laws have passed. And of those 17, there are roughly 9 that have some impact on Appendix G. And so I'm going to be discussing 8 of those local laws. Local Law 82 of 13, I'm not going to discuss at length, but just know that the department is required to author a flood manual, which will kind of summarize all of the construction provisions for construction in a special flood hazard area. That's forthcoming. Local Law 83 of 2013. Now, a lot of these local laws are kind of accentuating provisions that are already in the books. So this particular local law is one of them. For construction in a special flood hazard area, it was always required that a backwater valve be provided, but in many instances it was overlooked because there wasn't a specific reference in the plumbing code. So a plumbing designer or a plumber looking in the plumbing code wouldn't know to look to Appendix G or ASCE 24 for specific provisions related to backwater valves. So this particular local law makes explicit that backwater valves are required in the floodplain. It also makes explicit that buildings located in a special flood hazard area connected to a public sewer are subject to surcharge. So that's the reason for requiring these backwater valves. Also keep in mind that private sewage disposal systems, individual private sewage disposal systems are also required to provide the backwater valves, and this is so that during the flood event, the system won't discharge sewage into the flood waters, and also that flood waters won't make their way back into the building. So Local Law 95 of 13 addresses patient care areas, and it introduces a new definition for patient care areas for flood zone purposes, and that definition defines this patient care areas as spaces located within a building or portion thereof classified as Group I2, or spaces primarily used for the provision of medical services to persons, consultations spaces, treatment, evaluation, monitoring. And the way it amends Appendix G, it kind of treats these spaces as though they're residential for flood zone purposes, mandating that they be elevated above the design flood elevation. You're not permitted to dry flood-proof these spaces. There are exceptions to these patient care areas, and the exclusions include emergency departments and spaces with specialized equipment. For obvious reasons, emergency departments, you want to have at ground floor so that emergency personnel can deliver persons at ground level. And in many instances, specialized equipment is best suited below grade. So that's the reason for the exclusions. Local Law 96 of 13. I know we kind of did a whirlwind tour on the local laws, resiliency-related local laws, Gus, myself, and James Colgate, about a month ago, 2 months ago, where we discussed a lot of these, so this may be redundant for some of you, and I know that many of you are already familiar with Local Law 96 of 13, but just to reemphasize this point, there's been so many different types of mapping products released by FEMA. There were the advisory maps, the preliminary work maps, now the preliminary flood insurance rate maps. So there's so many questions as to what maps do I use, which ones are applicable to my particular project. And this Local Law 96 of 13 adopts the preliminary flood insurance rate maps into Appendix G, making it clear that these maps must be followed when filing a building in the special flood hazard area. Now, we can't just yet forget about the effective maps from 2007. Until FEMA releases their final version of these preliminary flood insurance rate maps, their effective firms of whatever that may be, effective firms of 2015, we still have to refer to both sets of maps. Of particular interest for this slide, you can see that we're looking at a small portion of a panel. There are roughly 340 panels in New York City, flood panels. This is for an area in Staten Island called Wolf's Pond. And if you look on the left-hand side, the effective firms from 2007 are showing a VE zone in some of the residential neighborhood there, which would require elevating a building on piles. Whereas on the right-hand side, the preliminary flood insurance rate maps from December 5th of 2013 are showing that same area in AE zone, which would not require a pile-supported foundation. So if an examiner was reviewing your plan today, they would require the VE zone type construction, the pile-supported foundation, until we adapt those effective firms and the 2007 maps go away. Local Law 96 of 13 also changed the city datum. So previously, the city datum was NGVD of 1929, National Geodetic Vertical Datum of 1929. Now all elevations must refer to the North American Vertical Datum of 1988. This is consistent with the flood insurance rate maps, and this is effective for new projects submitted on or after January 6th of 2014. And keep in mind, this applies regardless of whether your project is located in a special flood hazard area or not. So we have effectively changed the city datum, and it applies to all projects. Now, if you've previously submitted documents prior to the effective date of this law, and they were in a different datum, you could submit the final surveys or amended surveys in the reference datum that you previously used. Local Law 99 of 2013, this deals with cable length and fuel oil storage. Now, electrical work was always required. If you were performing electrical work in the special flood hazard area, you were always required to comply with ASCE 24. But electricians looking in the electric code never saw a reference to ASCE 24 or Appendix G or the building code, so they didn't know that there were specific provisions. So here we're also making reference in the New York City Electric Code to make explicit that flood requirements are applicable. So they were always applicable, but this local law is amending the electric code to make that clear. Unlisted entrance cables. So this permits unlisted conductive and non-conductive outside plant optical fiber cables entering buildings to exceed 50 feet to allow direct delivery above the DFE. Keep in mind that these particular types of cables are not permitted to be run in ducts or plenums that deliver environmental air. The fuel oil storage limitation was slightly increased. It now permits 3,000 gallons of fuel storage on the story above the DFE. Previously, that was 330 gallons. Now, keep in mind that there's a limitation of 1,500 gallons per tank, so you can have 2 tanks of 1,500 gallons, and there are stringent vault requirements for which each one of those tanks must be enclosed in. This is Local Law 100 of 2013, and this has a fairly significant impact on the location of fire protection equipment. Previously, the practice has been if you have a dry flood-proof building, non-residential for flood zone purposes is permitted to have a dry flood-proof building where you have dry flood-proof enclosures and you can locate some of your equipment below the design flood elevation in these dry flood-proof enclosures. This local law changes the fact, that fact, and states that certain fire protection equipment, pumps, electric valves, certain alarm components must be elevated. Even if you're a non-residential building, these particular pieces of equipment must be elevated above the design flood elevation. Certain hazardous storage, well, not necessarily hazardous, but certain types of storage is no longer permitted within dry flood-proofed enclosures. That includes medical, compressed or flammable gases, hazardous materials. They must all be elevated. Fuel oil fill and vent outlets must be elevated 3 feet above the design flood elevation. Design flood elevation is equal to the base flood elevation plus any required freeboards. So if you were required to have 1 foot of freeboard, this would now be base flood elevation plus 4. Hospitals, so that's I2 hospitals, the 500-year flood zone must design to the 0.2% flood elevation. So this is stating that hospitals located in the 500-year flood zone must also comply with the AE standards and AE zone standards and elevated to the 0.2 flood elevation. Or if the hospital is located in an AE zone, they must compare the 100-year flood elevation or the higher of the 100-year flood elevation or the 0.2% flood elevation and compare which one's higher and use that. Let's see. Here is a quick screenshot of Table 5-1, which is located in ASCE 24, and this is how Local Law 100 of 2013 amended this particular table. I'm just going to draw your attention to footnote C, which states that buildings that include I2 occupancies that are hospitals shall use the greater of 1, the design flood elevation for the applicable structural occupancy category as indicated in this table, or 2, the 500-year flood elevation. So just keep in mind that this footnote has been added by Local Law 100, and if you look in Local Law 141, you may not see this footnote now, but once the actual building code is printed, you'll see this footnote. So I'm going to make reference to this table again in reference to some other part of this presentation, and you won't see that footnote. But sometimes these local laws don't necessarily show up in Local Law 141. So this was already mentioned by James Colgate in his presentation. This is a retroactive compliance by 2033 requirement, and it has 2 different compliance paths. One, which he previously mentioned, which was using temporary connections to meet the requirements of this local law. And the other one is, which this particular slide is presenting, is elevating your equipment above the design flood elevation. So for this local law, generators in hospitals must power certain emergency, standby, and heating and cooling loads for 72 hours, or they can, and they're permitted to be connected to natural gas. Or you can provide temporary connections. So that's a temporary connection that will receive power from a temporary generator. I think what we're trying to drive home here is that relocating your generator, which we think most building owners are going to do because it's a far more resilient measure, is a better idea than providing a temporary connection. However, you can meet the retroactive compliance requirements by simply providing a temporary connection. For hospitals, it's also necessary that generators, heating and cooling plants, this is the difference here, heating and cooling plants must be above the design flood elevation. They're not permitted to be dry flood proofed unless temporary connections are provided. So the temporary connections can be provided, or you're relocating this equipment above the design flood elevation, not permitted to be dry flood proofed for hospitals. Nursing homes have a similar, nursing homes, assisted living, and adult homes have similar provisions. For the generators, the generator must power certain emergency loads unless a temporary connection is provided, or generators are located above the design flood elevation. No dry flood proofing of generators is permitted. Again, 2 compliance paths. One last time, relocating the equipment, which is far more resilient measure, or providing temporary connections to receive power, heating, and cooling from a temporary device that's brought on site after the building system's knocked out. Now, for Local Law 109, this clarifies that it's always been a building code requirement that for buildings that are dry flood-proof, non-residential for flood zone purposes, when you're deploying shields and gates and blocking means of egress, ASCE 24 requires that you must provide an alternate means of egress for the blocked means of egress. Now, we've gone a step farther here in New York City, and we've amended ASCE 24's provision and state that every required blocked means of egress must be provided with an alternate means of egress immediately adjacent to that blocked means of egress, which is a significant requirement and is often overlooked during the design phase and has to be dealt with during when objections are raised. So this local law kind of clarifies for folks that this blocked required means of egress has to be provided with an alternate means adjacent to and above the DFE. Now, this local law also permits buildings located in the 100-year floodplain and 500-year floodplain to install footings and supports for temporary flood shields and stairs and ramps a limited distance beyond the street line. That limited distance is 12 inches. It's not a lot, but it's something. Anything beyond that requires DOT approval, and they're in the process of writing a rule on exactly how revocable consents can be gotten from them. Pre-firm buildings and buildings intended to be evacuated during floods, temporary stairs and ramps may be employed. So if you have a building that's new construction and it's planned to be evacuated, they can deploy stairs and ramps over shields that are blocking egress. Or if you're a pre-firm building and you're kind of constrained by your existing egress plan, it's possible to use temporary stairs and ramps per this local law. Lastly, as far as the local laws are concerned, this local law 13 of 2014 requires gypsum and cement board installed in basements, cellars, and below ground spaces must be mold resistant. This applies to alterations, as James previously mentioned, to existing buildings as well as new buildings, and that particular mold resistant gypsum and cement board must have a rating of 10 when compared to ASTM D3273. I just want to check my notes really quickly. Okay, so there's a very long list of spaces that are required to comply with this local law. It includes interior faces of exterior walls of basements and cellars, walls and ceilings of rooms containing condensers, water tanks, water pumps, walls and ceilings of laundry rooms, portions of walls within 2 feet of kitchen sinks and stoves, 4 feet above the floor, walls and bathrooms not solely water closets, walls, ceilings, and service sink and closets. So these are all areas subject to moisture and water damage. There's a long list. I would suggest you take a look and find out exactly where these particular types of materials are required. So getting into the amendments by amendments to Appendix G by Local Law 141, there's a provision in BCG 304.1.2, which many of you are aware of if you do design buildings in the special flood hazard area. For non-residential buildings that are permitted to be dry flood proofed, the 2008 code had a restriction on the number of fixture counts within dry flood proof enclosures. This is a New York City specific requirement, and it states that no more than 1 toilet, sink, and 2 compartment laundry tray are permitted to be located within dry flood proofed enclosures. So this provision has been removed. So the plumbing fixture count is no longer constrained to 1 toilet, sink, and 2 compartment laundry tray to be located within dry flood-proofed enclosures. I think the fear at the time that this was added was that dwelling units would be connected to dry flood-proofed enclosures, and we didn't want these spaces to be converted, but it's clear now, or we think based on designs we've seen, that design professionals understand that dry flood-proofed enclosures are not to be connected with dwelling units. So BCG 501 is the section that modifies ASCE 24. ASCE 24 is the reference standard for flood-related design and construction. It's a national standard, and I urge you not to just rely on that standard without looking at BCG 501, because New York City has made extensive modifications to that reference standard. And in keeping with that, we have made more changes to that reference standard. So this is just a list of the changes to that reference standard from Local Law 141. All of the other local laws that I discussed before may or may not have made changes to that, and they'll all be summarized once we get a final version of Local Law 141 printed. So the takeaway here is that all of the tables in ASCE 24 have been amended to incorporate freeboard that was stated or that was amended by an emergency rule 360604, and also to incorporate the new coastal A-zone requirements, which I'll touch on in more detail. Here again, we're looking at Table 5-1. This is from Local Law 141. As I stated previously, you'll note that that footnote is not here, footnote C. with regard to hospitals, but I'll have you notice that previously the two columns on the right-hand side, which address the design flood elevation for V zones, now states coastal high hazard areas and coastal A zones. So this table now applies to coastal high hazard areas, V zones, and coastal A zones. Additionally, you'll notice that for structural occupancy category 2, 1 and 2 family homes and dwellings, this entire row is new, and it includes freeboard of 2 feet. So 1 and 2 family homes are required to be elevated to the base flood elevation plus 2 feet. I think that sort of summarizes the majority of the changes here. There may be more. This slide here summarizes all of the different changes that resulted from the adoption of the coastal A zone. Now, I'm going to talk about all of these different sections at length, so I'll skip the slide here. This illustration here is just to give you a little bit of background on coastal A zones. So the V zone is the area that is furthest from land. It's where the highest waves are. They're coming from the open ocean and they're making their way towards the land. And V zones will have wave heights that exceed 3 feet. They could be as high as 20 feet. But once they're less than 3 feet, we're transitioning out of the V zone and into the coastal A zone. So coastal A zones will have a wave height between 3 feet and 1.5 feet. And once you transition out of a wave height of 1.5 feet, now you're making your way into the A zone. So the A zone will have wave heights less than 1.5 feet. And this is wave height above the still water depth. So I won't read this entire definition of coastal A zones. Ultimately, it's saying that a coastal A zone has a wave height between 3 and 1.5 feet, and that coastal A zones are, the flooding source is a coastal flooding source. It's not a riverine or other type of flooding source. But I really want to accentuate the last sentence, which is in bold, and it's sort of driving home the point that coastal A zones are not immediately an effective requirement here. So it reads that in no case shall an area of special flood hazard be deemed a coastal A zone unless and until it has been identified as such on the adopted FEMA firms 360497. So as many of you know, our effective firms are from 2007. We do not have coastal A zones delineated on our effective firms from 2007. So because we don't have effective firms, we only have preliminary firms. We don't have coastal A zones delineated on our FEMA firms. We're expecting our FEMA firms sometime in 2015 that will delineate these coastal A zones, so that's why we've incorporated these provisions into our building code. This is a quick timeline which discusses, this is FEMA's timeline, and it discusses how this mapping product will make its way through the meat grinder. The preliminary firms are issued, and then 30 days after that, there's theoretically is a community coordination meeting held. That has not happened yet, so this process hasn't yet started yet, but from the community coordination meeting, there's a 90-day appeals period in which landowners can appeal the FEMA maps with scientifically based justification and attempt to get maps revised before they're released. All of the appeals are sent into FEMA, and so once the end of the appeals period has been reached, FEMA is obligated to review all of those appeals, and they resolve them, and they issue the final firms. They issue a letter of determination to the local community, and then roughly 6 months after that, we would adopt those maps, and they would become effective. So we're obligated to adopt those maps. It's not optional for us. We're expecting these firms sometime 2015. It could go plus 6 months, minus 6 months, but I think somewhere around 2015. So that would mean that our coastal A zone provisions would kick in once we adopt these maps. Here is a screenshot of the preliminary flood insurance rate maps, and this is an area you're all familiar with. This is Lower Manhattan on the east side. You can see the Holland Tunnel tubes on the left-hand side of this map, and that sawtooth black line there that makes its way pretty far inland is the coastal A zone. So this coastal A zone is bound by the VE zone on the Hudson River side, and then the other end of it is that black sawtooth line. So everything within this area is subject to coastal A zone requirements. The specific requirements are that coastal A zone buildings, buildings that are located in a coastal A zone, any new buildings or substantially improved buildings, substantially damaged buildings, shall comply with V zone construction standards. So that's a very significant thing for buildings located in the coastal A zone, V zone construction standards. That's basically going to require pile foundations, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but there are two significant exceptions to this requirement, and one of them is consistent with FEMA's recovery advisories following Hurricane Ike, I believe. That's the wave-resisting stem wall foundation, and the second is the wave-resisting dry flood-proofing wall and foundation system, and that's sort of a specific requirement here in New York City, but we thought it prudent and completely acceptable for dry flood-proof buildings to be designed to resist a 3 foot to 1.5 foot high wave. This is a picture of buildings that are on the left-hand side. You have a building that's built to V-zone standards. This is typical V-zone construction. Here, the design flood elevation is measured to the lowest horizontal structural member. So, design flood elevation would be measured somewhere from in here. And the building on the right-hand side is exhibiting typical damage associated with coastal A zone. This is light frame construction, wood frame construction, slab on grade likely, and those waves just went right through the sheathing and knocked out some of the studs. So this is typical for coastal A zone areas, and this Hurricane Ike Recovery Advisory made recommendations that such buildings either be constructed to V-zone construction requirements, like the one on the left-hand side, or employ stem wall type construction. So wave-resisting stem wall construction, I'm going to jump between two slides here so you can kind of illustrate what we're talking about. This particular detail is from FEMA's P550. It contains a lot of the typical details of foundations in coastal high hazard areas, and this is their stem wall construction that we modeled our regulations after. You can see that, going back here, so one of the requirements are that the underside of the stem wall foundation system be elevated to the design flood elevation specified in Table 4-1 of ASC 24. So that's the underside of the floor slab. Typically in AE construction, AE zones, we're measuring from the top of the lowest floor. But here we're talking about the underside of the lowest floor. So that's something to keep in mind. We've got these tsunami-like blue waves coming crashing into the side of this stem wall. This appears to be reinforced concrete foundation with a reinforced masonry block stem wall. And a second requirement is that stem walls enclosing areas below the design flood elevation is prohibited. So in the AE zone, you can use the area below the lowest floor for parking, storage, and building access, and it's acceptable to enclose that area in a wet flood-proof enclosure. However, in the coastal A zone area, you'll notice that this is completely backfilled here with earth, and it's not possible for anyone to convert that space to anything other than storage of backfill. Okay, so additionally, flood openings are not required in stem walls because you're designing for a condition where you have unequal forces in some cases, where you could have hydrostatic forces on one side and saturated earth on the other side. You're taking this into account when you're doing your design. So it's not mandatory to allow the water in to equalize the hydrostatic pressure, as is the case in the AE flood zone. So here are a couple of forces that you must design for. ASCE 7 would contain more detail about this. So we're talking about wave action, debris impact, erosion, local scour, soil pressure behind the wall, hydrostatic loading, live and dead surcharge loads from the slab above, sliding, uplift, and overturning. Wave-resisting dry floodproofing walls and foundation system is another method of another exception to the coastal A zone requirements of building a building to V zone standards. So if you have a non-residential building for flood zone purposes, you can dry floodproof that building. And we're saying it's permissible to dry floodproof a building in the coastal A zone, provided you account for the wave impacts on the side of that building. So it's going to be a robust building, likely. These non-residential buildings, for the most part, have extremely high gravity loads and shouldn't have much issues with resisting these waves. But in some cases, we have seen these little pizza parlors that are non-residential for flood zone purposes, one story, and they're wondering how they're going to comply with this, and it may not be feasible to dry floodproof such buildings. So just keep in mind that it is going to require a structural analysis to determine if the building is capable of resisting these loads. So non-residential buildings should be dry floodproofed in accordance with section 304.1.2. The design flood elevation is specified in ASCE 24 table 6-1, and calculations have to be provided that demonstrate foundation, building, and flood shields will resist wave action. So here is just a typical diagram. This is from FEMA P936, and it's talking about all the different loads imposed on a dry flood-proofed foundation system. You've got dynamic forces, hydrodynamic forces from the waves, hydrostatic forces below the waves. You've got saturated soil pressures on the side of the foundation below grade, buoyant forces pushing on the slab, wanting to pop it out of the ground. So there's a lot to consider when you're doing dry flood proofing, and so we always urge that the structural engineer be involved with this particular exercise. And here's a scenario where there was a building that prior to Hurricane Sandy was employing flood shields, and I can't say that they're located in a coastal A zone, but when the MAT team and Department of Buildings staff went through the building and discussed with them some of what happened during the flood condition, they stated that, and this building was designed to the design flood elevation with a little bit of freeboard, so they actually went above and beyond the building code. They actually had their shields deployed, everything was great, and then they had a wave continually lapping over the side of the shields, and it filled the subgrade parking and everything below grade. I think there were 2 sub-cellars, and destroyed all of their boilers, and everything that they had below grade had to be replaced. And that was because these waves just sort of lapped 6 inches over that shield. So this is their new technique. It's basically a full height door that can be deployed, closed, and I would imagine they could take a 10-foot wave now, but we'll see. So V-zone and coastal A-zone permit applications shall include certifications as applicable. This is the structural design certification, breakaway wall certification where built like V-zone, and utility certification. And I think that covers it. So at this time, I'm going to ask all the presenters to come back up, and we're going to open the floor up to questions. So just bear with us a second while everyone comes back up.